Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we are going to discuss a very serious topic that affects so many families and especially so many women who are victims of domestic violence. And this is how children are used and how abusers weaponize children when it comes to separation, especially after an abusive relationship. So, after a separation, we are going to invite Dr. Tracy King to join us in this. Dr. Tracy actually works within the court system with mothers and children as well. Oftentimes, these are called high conflict cases. So, high conflict divorce. And this usually involves mental illness. So, this often involves personality disorders such as narcissistic personality disorder and other pathological and high conflict personalities. So let's go ahead and invite Dr. Tracy. Come on in, Dr. Tracy. We are excited for you to join. I know that this is something that in my life, there's definitely a lot of women and personal experiences with this. And it's been a huge challenge. And the points that we are going to discuss, oh, it says Dr. Tracy is unable to join. I wonder why. We'll try and join her again. But the points that we're going to discuss is how children become a part of, hey, Dr. Tracy, this
Hi.
coercive control. Hey, the
Hi.
second thing we're going to discuss is what this does to children and how it's often misunderstood, and what psychologists and family courts understand, uh, what psychologists
Mm.
wish the family courts would understand about trauma in this case. Dr.
Yeah.
Tracy, I'm so excited you're here. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing today?
I'm good. So I was just telling everyone what this live
Hmm.
is about, that I was desperately trying to add you to this live, and that we
Mm.
have these 3 points that we'll be discussing, which is on the like covered at the bottom of the post. So
Yes.
thank you for
Yeah.
joining. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I think following on from the last live that we did, I think it's about thinking when a relationship ends, when somebody finally gets out of that controlling coercive relationship, there's like a sigh of relief. However, if there's children that are shared between the two partners, often that control will continue with how that co-parenting is managed, and it's not really co-parenting. It's where that controlling coercive partner will continue to try to control through perhaps changing times of contact, or perhaps blocking holidays, or maybe not allowing things to happen, or asking the children about what mum is doing back home, for example. And again, like we said last time, we're talking about this from a female perspective, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen the other way around. That's just our particular audience. But one of the things I really see very frequently is how children are placed in the middle and are asked to report back about what's happening at home. Has mum met anyone? What's mum been doing? Why didn't she help you with your homework? Which might seem a simple question, but when it's layered with all of the other things, it starts to build up a picture. And I think that's what's important, because we can, in any co-parenting relationship, there can be conflict, there can be disagreement, there can be different ways of parenting, but it doesn't have to be controlling and coercive. And it's if we see those repetitive patterns kind of ticking all of those boxes, we then start to see that coming through. And I think it's very unusual, not impossible, but very unusual, for if there's been control and coercion within the relationship, that pattern is going to continue unless someone's got help, or unless somebody's perhaps doing that elsewhere.
100%.
Mm.
And I think another big part of this that no one really talks about is parental alienation and the
Mm.
confusion around that. Because as I know
Mm.
a bunch of people in my life,
Mm.
specifically, they all happen to be women, as they
Mm.
see that this domestic abuse is crossing into the separation and how
Mm.
their children are being weaponized. So their
Yeah.
children are being told, are you sure you want to go
Mm.
back to mom? Oh, maybe you don't really want to go back to mom. Like, and it's
Mm.
almost this threatening presence saying, hey, if you go back to mom, that will make me really unhappy. And so
Mm.
it's a really slow
Mm.
process of making the child feel that having a relationship with their mother,
Mm,
especially in the context of what I'm going through within
mm,
my peers, making the child feel if you have a relationship with your mother, you're going to be in danger around me, or I will disapprove of you, or I will remove my care, I'll remove my love,
mm,
I'll remove my support from you. And also, as you were referencing before, making the child slowly but surely believe that there's something very wrong with their mother. Like,
mm,
oh, you know, if your mother is seeing someone else, oh, well, isn't that too soon? Don't you think that's
mm,
terrible? So, and then I think the confusing part of this is when is especially in the context of the experiences that my friends are going through
mm.
as they try to protect their children from this
Yes.
because either there's physical abuse, emotional abuse,
Mm,
financial abuse, then they're seen as the alienating parent. So it's
mm,
actually their response to this alienation and to this financial
mm,
abuse, physical, emotional abuse, all turns them into the spotlight where the court says, oh, look at this
mm,
mother, she must be the alienating one because she is so
mm,
upset every time this
mm,
child, is going through that type of dynamic. So, is that something
mm.
you see a lot? What is your
Yeah,
experience?
100%. I see very often whereby it's said the woman is upset that the child is going to see dad. And again, that upset is because the mum can see what's happening to the child when the child goes to see dad. And it's often in those cases that are quite complex that I would get called in to do a psychological assessment. And actually, when you unpick it, there is a lot more complexity there. And there's a lot more backstory with the woman and the time in the relationship than has been considered usually by the court. It's not always put forward because courts will often come from a perspective of, well, we know that it's best if children have contact with both parents, so therefore we're going to just do what we can for that to happen. And they'll kind of almost go through the path of least destruction, which is a good thing too. But it's about thinking what has not been considered, what's being missed here, why is this person behaving in this way. And one of the things that I look at, like I said, is the pattern. Is like, is this a one-off behavior? Is this something that this person is doing repetitively? Are we seeing one parent saying something has to happen, the other one doesn't have the freedom to disagree, and then the other one is constantly adapting their life to sort of meet the needs of the other person because of fear of retaliation. And when you unpick things, you can kind of start to see where the power balance lies. That's one thing we would look at. And then thinking about what's the penalty of not agreeing with that coercive controlling person. What happens when you say no to them or you set a reasonable boundary? Is there space for negotiation, or are there threats? Is there a withdrawal of contact? Is there a humiliation? Are there allegations? So often in cases like this, it's about going through the timeline and thinking, okay, this was happening then, and this was happening then. So what's the antecedent? Like, what behavior came first? What was the function of the next behavior, and what's the consequence of all of that? And trying to understand it in a step-by-step process. But I think the key part is also the positioning of the child, like of these parents who is trying to protect the child from any adult dispute, or who is kind of recruiting the child as a messenger in some way, as a sort of spy or an ally to judge and take a view, like we were saying, on the other carer. Because if this is healthy co-parenting, there can be disagreement, there can be differences in boundaries, like I say, but coercive control is going to create fear, constraint, and consequence. And that fear, constraint, and consequence will go through the whole ecosystem of the family. So the child will show subtle signs of that. There will be fear, there will be fear of consequence, which could come from just knocking something off the table. Those sort of interactions will show you, well, where has that child learned that there's a consequence. You might have dad saying, oh yes, so that they're really, really good, and I don't ever sort of have to tell them off or anything like that. But then they spend most time with dad, and then you see that jumpiness when something happens, and you've got to wonder, where has that come from? Where do these behaviors emerge from, essentially?
I love that. And so it's really
Mm.
being able to put the lens
Mm.
um, on seeing how is this child doing? This child is anxious. Why is the child anxious? And that
Yeah.
moves into our point number three. Why is the child
Mm.
anxious? Why are they chronically stressed?
Yeah.
I think it's
Mm.
also especially with parental alienation,
mm,
people don't understand this, but
mm,
when the parental alienation is working, the child will actually prefer the abuser. So they'll say, yes, I
mm,
always want to be with my abuser because,
mm,
in this case, because my mother is so
mm,
terrible and she's so crazy and she's
mm,
causing chaos and she is so histrionic and my
mm,
mother's controlling. So it's all of these, it's the flip of reality where because the abuser is
mm,
controlling and chaotic and constantly switching plans, they
mm,
now frame the mother as you're abusing, you're chaotic, you're switching plans. And so this child
mm,
will prefer to be with the abuser. And people will often ask,
mm,
especially in the context of what I'm going through within my
mm.
circles, a lot of women are a part of this type of
Yeah.
abuse. And they'll ask the mothers such a politically incorrect and insensitive question, not to be mean, but out of ignorance, and say, but why doesn't the child choose to, maybe the child will just choose
Yeah.
to be with you. And you're like, no,
Mm,
the child doesn't choose to be with the mother in cases of parental alienation. They choose
mm,
to be with the abuser. That means the alienation is working. And people don't
mm,
understand that in the context of
mm.
coercion and control and emotional abuse.
And also it's very often that pattern begins because the child feels safer with the mother. So in terms of attachment and how attachment patterns work, those kind of early imprints that we have as what relationships look like for us, if there's more security or safety in a relationship, there's more capacity to say a negative about someone. So one of the core attachment measures that I use with children is a really old one from the 1960s called the family relations test, but it's used extensively in court, and it's quite a quick measure of looking at like what kind of attributions does a child give to each parent. And what you will often see is there's a very, very idealized version of a parent, which might not mean that parent's being abusive, but when you look at that idealized version that the child has along with all of the other patterns, it starts to form a picture. And often it's safer for the child. They've got to make a survival adaptation living with the abuser. And if they take the same narrative, it's none of this is conscious. It's really core nervous system responsivity. And it's about taking that side, not cognitively like we do as adults, but it's just going along with what is the safest option. And actually, at some level, to be negative with mum is easier because they may even know that mum's always going to be there regardless, but the consequence of not agreeing with dad might be far greater.
100%. I love that you said
Mm,
that. And you actually made me
mm,
think of something where I think that is the fawn
mm,
response, where the child says, well,
mm,
I need to go along with the abuser because they
mm,
are more powerful, they are more coercive. I
mm,
don't have a choice. With mom, I have a choice. And also, I can describe mom in a more complex way. Mom is really
mm,
great at, being there for me. She's kind and loving.
mm,
She's a terrible cook. And sometimes
mm,
she gets,
exactly.
sometimes she
Mm,
gets annoyed. And then they'll describe the abuser, which in this case would be, especially in my
mm,
experiences with who I'm working with, and it's dad, and they'll say,
mm,
dad is perfect, dad is
mm,
amazing, dad is up, and it goes on where there's nothing bad about dad, and you really have to
mm,
ask yourself, what kind of fawn response is this? Why is this child so afraid to,
mm,
as this is a subconscious reaction, why is this child so afraid where this response happens and they cannot see their father in a
mm,
more complex way, saying, yeah, actually, I really don't like it when I feel like I don't have choice, or I
mm.
really don't like it when I feel like I
Absolutely.
can't call my mom when I'm with my dad, things like that.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
and it's again
Mm,
that flips script,
yeah.
because even like as we
Mm,
said before, with parental alienation, as my friends have been
mm,
trying to protect their children in that context,
yeah.
they'll say, don't call your dad, every
Mm,
single day when you're with me, which is not great, but they understand
mm,
that the dad will say, where are you? Where is mom? I'm going to show up.
mm,
I'm going to be there. I'm going to sabotage. So
mm,
that's putting both child and mother in a rock and a hard place with
mm,
continuing with that domestic violence and playing that into how do we use child custody and visitation as
mm,
a way to show up, as a way to torment, as a way to show
mm,
control. And that's really, really difficult, I think, for
mm,
therapists, for judges, for everyone to really unpack
mm,
and to recognize, why is this response happening? Is it a
mm,
logical and reasonable response to something that's
mm,
very, violent and aggressive
mm,
and can be fear
mm.
based?
Absolutely. It plays out quite interestingly in sibling groups as well. So, where there's sometimes a split in the sibling group across parents as a consequence of these behaviors, or other times you might see that an older sibling might be actually monitoring what the younger sibling reports as well, because they're the older sibling, which then the coercive controlling parent might take more control of, and then that filters through the family system. And I see that quite a lot where I've done assessments in schools, and older siblings will run out of class and they'll come into the room to try and understand what's happening. They know there's an assessment today. They know that their sibling's seeing a psychologist and what's going to happen next, and what, they'll try to sort of moderate what's being said.
100%.
Mm,
And that makes sense.
mm,
And I
mm,
think a big part of the healthy reaction within those
mm,
dynamics is I would love my
mm,
children to have a great relationship. I want them to be together at all times. I think a part of that
mm,
response where, an abuser might
mm.
use the older child to moderate is,
Yeah.
well, why are you separating the children with timing, with
Mm,
activities? Why are you trying to pull them apart?
mm,
Why are you trying to
mm,
isolate one child and be with them? And, I
yeah.
think that plays into the
Mm,
dynamic of if you're a healthy parent, you want your children to be supportive and
mm,
loving and kind with each other. You don't want to separate them and say, actually, I'm going to put you in two
mm,
different camps or two different schools or two different cities
yeah.
or two different
Mm,
countries, as because that again would play into a power dynamic. You want
mm.
your children to be together as a healthy caretaker.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
definitely. And I think what's hard for people to understand is why a child might protect an abusive parent. And I see that a lot. Again, people will say things like, well, I know I've been accused of abusing my ex-partner and my children, but if that's the case, why do my children want to visit me? And it again, like you said, it's coming from like a place of ignorance and a lack of awareness, but also a place of a kind of cognitive distortion, like a thinking error within the setup of the abuser, where they're using that as a justification that their behaviors are okay. So again, it becomes quite complex. And there is still love. I think this is a complexity as well. Even if we are harmed by someone, we could still feel love for that person. And it may be a toxic love at some level, but when there's a genetic bond, again, like we've said before in other talks that we've done, that's so entrenched. It's so hard for people to, and for children particularly, to do that because they've depended on that parent, and that parent is part of them, and there are fears about what will happen if they speak up, and they've got that dependence, and they might wish to keep the family together, so they might feel that if they then keep the abuser happy, actually that protects mom at some level. So that separation for them, I've worked with children that say, oh, I'd much prefer to not see mom because that keeps her away from dad, and there's a protection, which none of which should be there, but because they've been in that dynamic, that's evolved.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm,
And and it's interesting drawing back to that. I think it's also people have almost overly um, almost overly complicate things in
mm,
the sense that they'll say, okay,
mm,
we know that especially
mm,
within, I'm going to keep bringing it back into
yeah,
the
mm,
context of who I've been living with,
mm,
dealing with, working with my friendships,
yeah,
the people
mm,
I've been coaching. So these are female domestic violence
mm,
survivors, and I think it's not often you'll
mm,
see that there is an aggressor who chokes his
mm,
partner, who dominates, controls, emotionally abuses
mm,
his partner, financially abuses his partner. And then people will say, but isn't he a wonderful dad? I
mm,
don't think you could be a wonderful dad and have a healthy attachment
mm,
if you're trying to kill the mother of your child, if you're trying to
mm,
denigrate and abuse the mother of your child. That
mm,
shows a lack of emotional
mm,
capacity for healthy attachment to
mhm,
anyone, right? So what we're saying is if you're
mm,
able to do that to the woman you're with and to the mother of your child, we have to use that same concept to
mm,
say you're actually not capable of healthy attachment
mm,
because there's no such thing as a very healthy attachment to a child when you're trying
mm.
to harm their mother. You
No,
understand?
absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely, and harm anyone else knowingly, because what that's showing us is that their own, talking of it in nervous system terms, their own window of tolerance is minimal if they are that reactive. So therefore, that reactivity is going to kind of trump the fact that that connection, we can only connect when we're in that ventral vagal state, and they're not going to be in that if they're consistently having that reactivity. So it's a real challenge. Biologically, the two things can't be present at the same time. They might have a bond, there might be some warmth in the relationship, but it's not a secure attachment. They can't attach
100%.
securely there.
100%. And I think that's the confusing part for many. I
Mm,
mean, women stay in these
mm,
relationships, in these marriages for 30 to 50 years. Like they'll stay
mm,
forever,
mm,
and it's both heartbreaking and just the
mm,
reality. So to say it's difficult to leave an abuser because sometimes they're charming, sometimes they're nice, sometimes they're
mm,
kind, sometimes they'll go out of their
mm,
way for you. But I think what people also, I think what helps to
mm,
reframe that connection is when it gets bad,
mm,
how bad does it get? Because in a healthy
mm,
dynamic, how bad does it get is, well, sometimes we'll raise our voices. Or in a healthy dynamic, how bad does it get? Well, it gets bad enough that we'll want to spend a few days away from each other. But in
mm,
an unhealthy relationship, how bad does it get?
mm,
Physical,
mm,
coercive, manipulative. He'll try and
mm,
call the police on me and lie about something.
mm,
How bad it gets is actually a really important marker for, is
mm,
this abusive? Because if it's wonderful, sometimes that's great. But how bad does it
mm,
get is, if it's bordering on abusive, then it's bad enough
mm,
to consider walking away, whether,
mm,
whatever dynamic that is, a parent relationship, a child relationship,
mm.
a spouse relationship.
And in fact, that point of separation is when it is likely to escalate, because that abuser has lost that control, has lost that capacity to be directly coercive in the way that's familiar to them. So they've got to kind of think outside the box and think about how they're going to do that next. How are they going to maintain that control? And I think that's why you do see the escalation so much when there's been that final rejection.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I
Mm,
think that's the translation. It's saying, I used to have
mm,
this woman that I can control, dominate,
mm,
and abuse. But now that I no longer have this woman I can control,
mm,
dominate, and abuse, I have this huge gap in my life. I need to use the child to control, dominate, abuse, because
mm,
they emotionally are reliant on somebody to control, dominate, and abuse. Who's
yeah,
next? Right? And
yeah.
that's who's in the picture right now. So I think people
Mm,
often, it's difficult for them to see this type of structure because we want to believe in beauty, we
mm,
want to believe in love, we want to believe that, oh,
mm,
50-50 is great for everyone. But
mm,
in domestic abuse cases, this is who we're
mm.
dealing with, and this is what we really
Absolutely.
need to see. We need to see it with our eyes in order to
Mm,
protect the women, in order to protect the children. And you're
yeah.
right, sometimes it's,
Mm,
there are female abusers. We're not going to, say there
yeah.
aren't. But I think, in the
Mm,
context of the world we live in,
yes.
it's very often, the women,
Mm,
and that's why I speak to them. But
yeah.
I do as well validate that
Mm,
it's not only ever women. And then the other thing you brought up here is um, the court saying we prefer to go 50-50,
mm,
therefore let's just go with the path of least resistance. And what we see
mm,
is within this path of least resistance, it's expecting oftentimes within the world that we live in,
mm,
you're the woman, why aren't you being more agreeable? You're the woman, why aren't you being more flexible? You're the woman, why
mm,
are you being so complicated and making demands?
mm,
And it's allowing more, there's a gender bias to this oftentimes, where he's a
mm,
man, of course he can make demands. He's a man, of course he wants to
mm,
be in control. He's a man, of course you have to bend to his will. And so how do
mm.
you see that a gender bias plays into this?
I think it's probably a little bit less in some of the UK courts, I would say. It is there, but I think it's getting less and less. I still don't think that there's enough seen of what's been happening within a relationship, particularly when we don't have like the local authority, so our social services involved. If it's private law where there's been a separation and there are no child protection services involved, that's when you see it a whole lot more. Whereas if there's child protection services involved, everyone kind of ups the ante and they know that they have to look into things a whole lot more. So I think it's when in private law, I think sometimes again, because often I've seen cases where the man's in whatever job he's in and he can afford legal representation, whereas the woman can't. And I've seen women having to represent themselves as well that I've had to undertake assessments for. And I think that balance is not always catered for in some way. And I think courts need to understand that when things about the children that they're not understanding too. I think they need to understand, like, if a child is silent and not saying anything, that doesn't mean everything's okay, and if a child, like we said before, if a child shows affection for somebody that a woman is saying is abusive, that's usual too. And if a child is rejecting a parent, it doesn't tell us why they're rejecting the parent, so it doesn't mean that there's a problem with that parent. It means that we need to understand what that rejection is about. So I think, in private law cases, there needs to be more and more expert assessment than there probably is, and I think that's what needs to be asked for as well, because often, I hear of cases where that wasn't offered to them. So I think people need to speak up and say this whole family needs a global family psychological assessment before we can step forward in this case.
100%. So what you're
Mm.
saying is when there's public, especially in the UK, there might be
Mm.
more trauma-informed, more gendered
Mm.
sensitive
Yeah.
information and education to say,
Mm.
okay, well, we understand that we're Child Protective
Mm.
Services. We need to really take a deeper dive. But when it comes to the
Yeah.
private court system, which is oftentimes,
Mm.
a more North American
Yeah.
factor where it's,
Yeah.
where it's
Mm.
basically private,
Mm.
the woman will have to go through years
Mm.
and years and years of paying legal
Yeah.
fees, and
Mm.
oftentimes we still have a gender gap, a pay gap,
Mm.
where, even having a child, you're off work for all those months and
Yeah.
all those weeks. And,
Mm.
so we
Mm.
still have that financial difference where
Mm.
oftentimes, or more often, the man can afford better lawyers, longer, years and years of being represented, whereas the woman will not. And once again, that will
Mm.
come into play and
Mm.
put her at a disadvantage. And to speak to your
Mm.
other point where you said, well, showing when a child shows
Mm.
affection to one parent and not the other, I think
Mm.
that also speaks to how underinformed
Mm.
the humans, people, the communities, and
Mm.
especially the court system are to,
Mm.
well, why isn't this child's, giving affection to both
Mm.
parents? And what does it mean to be trauma bonded to one
Yeah.
parent
Mm.
because of an abuse going on versus
Mm.
rejecting another parent because they have to and they don't feel safe having a relationship with that other
Mm.
parent. So
Mm.
yeah, I think it's all of this really speaks to the fact that I think what I see with the North American courts
Mm.
is there's a huge legal and financial disadvantage for women, especially within, I can name at least 5 different women
Mm.
in my circles who are going through
Mm.
this. So I'm glad we're having this conversation because it is
Mm.
complex and it's confusing, and often the
Mm.
scripts are flipped. So dealing with all these flipped
Mm.
scripts, when one person is abusive and
Mm.
they're calling the other person abusive and they get the
Yeah.
child on their side,
Mm.
boy, this is confusing for the people, the community. It's
Mm.
confusing for, for everyone. But at the same time, I think, erring on the side of
Mm.
believe women when they say they've suffered an assault, believe women when
Mm.
they say there's domestic abuse, believe women, let's have a
Mm.
culture of believing women, because that's a good starting point.
Yeah.
When we want to protect women
Mm.
and children, and the statistics are there. And obviously, as we keep saying, definitely
Mm.
domestic violence isn't only a female issue, but it's predominantly a female issue. And I think that's why it's important to me to have this conversation.
Yeah, and I think one of the key questions that I often end up asking when I have done family assessments is, if I've got a man that's saying, oh, she was terrible, she used to do this when we were together, she used to be like this with the children when we were together. The key question is, well, why didn't you do anything then? Why did the relationship end because she ended it? Why were you not protecting the children at that stage? Because the narrative becomes something that puts the aggressor in a different light because they've accepted that treatment of the children when they've been together, if that's the narrative that they're giving. So often that's the question that makes things crumble a little bit, because it doesn't make sense. If you're protecting your children so much now, why did you, why were you not able to speak up before, and why is it that you didn't end the relationship? Now, of course, we know that when you're in an abusive relationship, things aren't that easy, but it's when that other person is saying that it's all one person that those questions need to be asked, really.
I love that. And that really
Mm.
goes together with when someone has a track record of behavior and a track record of
Mm.
making certain decisions, that's likely, and it's
Mm.
often a pattern.
Mm.
So saying,
Mm.
okay, well, you are not showing a pattern of protecting your children. You're
Mm.
suddenly just feeling really protective of your children
Mm.
today.
Mm,
now that this separation has happened, oops, I'm
yeah,
feeling protective,
absolutely.
right? So I think that's
Mm,
exactly speaking to, okay, well, what is a person's track
mm,
record of decisions, of behavior, of mental health? All of that
mm,
comes into a larger, more
yeah.
holistic picture of how do they behave? Oh,
Mm,
sometimes they get into arguments,
mm,
or and they're violent with other people, or sometimes they do this with
mm,
other people. Same to what you said before. Well, a
mm,
history of aggression with other people is actually really important, because that comes into play. Well, aggression might come up in different situations. This is in their
exactly.
past, and this is
Mm,
often a cycle of behavior. You don't suddenly do this one thing, a one act of aggression
mm,
once in your life. It's possible. Is it usual? No. So I think that's kind of
exactly.
where psychology comes in. Yeah,
Mm,
100%.
yeah, absolutely. I think also just listening to evidence that people give, often courts and police will still think that if something is true, there needs to be like clear sequencing, there needs to be clear memory of exactly how something has happened. So the system doesn't allow for the fragmentation of trauma-based memories. And that's often something that as a psychologist, I'm reminding people, that research shows us that when people are being deceptive, actually they might actually show a much stronger narrative. They might actually give you something that maybe one parent is coaching a child, and you're going to get something that's a whole lot more coherent than you would get if a child had actually been in that situation that's being reported. So things like that need to be looked at as well.
Yeah, trauma memory, that's a
Mm,
big one.
mm,
That's,
yeah.
yeah, that's a very big one. And
Mm,
I know that often comes into play with sexual assault cases, because it's
mm,
like
yeah.
just fragments of moments where people are like, this
Mm,
happened. Oh no, I also remember this other thing happened. And it
yeah,
just
exactly.
fragmented because it's just
Yeah,
too overwhelming, right? So
yeah,
there's not that
absolutely.
beginning, middle, end, 100%.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm,
So this has been like a really
mm,
important yet complex conversation that we're having.
mm,
Is there, based on the points that we've
mm,
discussed so far, what else would you like to
mm.
add before we slowly wrap things up?
I think it's just coming back to what we were saying about, my kind of way of thinking it is about the pattern, power, and the positioning of the child. And I think those are the important things, like the 3 Ps. It's like pattern, power, positioning, because those are the things that tell you where the dynamic really lies if you're looking at that. And I think that's important to think about.
Thank you, 100%.
Mm,
And I think a big part of it also, and that we didn't mention, but I'll just
mm,
mention it quickly because it came to
mm,
mind as we culminate this, is I think enablers are a huge part of this issue. I
mm,
think that we're all part of communities, friendships, families, to some capacity. And
mm,
when it comes to abuse dynamics, what we can do is say abusers would not be able to continue
mm,
damaging the women and the
mm,
children in this context if they were not enabled. So enabling abusers is a huge
mm,
part of this issue. So I'd say, whether you're male,
mm,
female, whatever color, whatever age you are, please keep in mind to support survivors of domestic violence and
mm,
not become an enabler of that
mm,
abuser, because many things have happened throughout history where we're like, oh my goodness, there's
mm,
just one
mm,
dictator and all of this happened, and we're like, yeah, because
mm.
of the enablers.
Yeah.
One dictator
Mm,
cannot do much damage without a whole bunch of enablers. So we, in
mm,
our own little
mm,
lives and communities, if there's one dictator trying to wrought damage on their own family, on their own community, on
yeah.
their own
Mm,
relationship, please do not help them be an enabler. And be an enabler, please
mm,
support the survivor support, especially in this context where we're saying,
mm,
the female survivors of domestic violence, believe women
mm.
and support them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's
Mm.
important. I think it's about maintaining curiosity, not thinking that you're reaching a conclusion and there's a done deal and a verdict. It's staying curious.
100%, 100%.
Mm,
You have been
mm,
always such a pleasure to talk to.
mm,
So enlightening, so
mm.
informative. Thank you so much for joining us. And if anybody else has any other questions, Dr. Tracy works with these types of family matters, and you can reach out to Dr. Tracy. I'm Tanya, I'm a nurse, and I work with the nervous system and over 13 different types of movement and somatic-based therapy. So you can check out Dr. Tracy's work and Rewire Trauma Therapy's work. We're sending you lots of love and lots of support.
Thank you. See you later. Bye bye.